The wind had howled through the valley all night, tearing loose branches from the cottonwoods and scattering them across the fence line. At first light, Caleb Rowan was out inspecting the damage, boots sinking into the thawing earth as he followed the broken posts down toward the river. He expected to find nothing more serious than a few rails knocked loose, but then a violent splash shattered the quiet. It wasn't the sound of an animal drinking or drifting through the shallows. It was frantic, desperate, the kind that only came from something or someone fighting for life. Caleb quickened his pace, sliding down the bank. Out in the freezing current, a huge form heaved against the water, arms striking out with sluggish, fading force. The river slapped against her body, rolling her under before she surged back up with a broken gasp. The breath caught in Caleb's chest when he realized she was a woman, taller and broader than any he had ever seen, her skin mottled with bruises, her limbs torn as though she'd been dragged over rocks or beaten senseless before being thrown in. There wasn't time to wonder what had happened or who she was. Instinct moved his muscles before thought caught up. He flung himself into the river, the water biting him like knives, stealing his breath on contact. She was sinking again when he reached her. Her weight pulled him down with her, the cold numbing his hands as he fought to lift her head above the water. His old knee screamed with every kick, a familiar pain he had learned to ignore, but the river pushed harder still, as though the current meant to claim her. Caleb clenched his jaw, forcing his way back toward the bank inch by inch, dragging her with him until at last the mud gripped his boots and he hauled her from the water. She collapsed onto the damp ground with a heavy thud, her chest rising in shallow, trembling breaths. Up close, Caleb could see the brutal truth of what had been done to her. Rope burns circled her wrists in raw, angry grooves. Long welts striped her back and shoulders. Deep purple bruises bloomed across her ribs. Whoever hurt her hadn't meant to frighten her. They'd meant to erase her. A slow, simmering fury curled inside Caleb, spreading through him like fire catching dry brush. He knelt beside her, brushing wet strands of black hair from her face. Her eyes were shut tight, lashes trembling with pain, her lips turning blue from the cold. When he touched her arm, her body jerked weakly, as though expecting another blow. "Easy," he murmured, unsure whether she could hear him. She didn't answer. Her shivers grew harsher, violent enough to shake her whole frame. Caleb could feel her slipping away. He gathered her into his arms, the weight of her nearly staggering him, and carried her uphill to the small cabin. The place was hardly more than 4 walls, a roof that groaned in strong wind, and a hearth with little more than dying embers, but it was shelter. He laid her on his bed and threw off his coat, dropping to his knees to rebuild the fire. Sparks leapt, flames growing until warmth began to chase away the bite of winter. He covered her with the thickest blanket he owned, though the chill still clung to her skin like frost. Only after the fire had steadied did he fetch water and begin tending her wounds. Each bruise told a story he didn't want to imagine. Each cut revealed the cruelty of whoever had bound her, beaten her, and left her to die in the river's grasp. Hours later, after Caleb had cleaned and wrapped most of her injuries, the woman stirred. It was only a small twitch of her fingers at first, then a tremor in her shoulders, and finally a sharp intake of breath as awareness fought its way back into her. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened fully, revealing eyes as dark as obsidian, eyes filled with wild panic. Before Caleb could speak, she tried to bolt upright. Pain ripped through her body, forcing a cry from her throat, and she fell back against the mattress. Caleb reached out on instinct, but stopped halfway, holding his hands where she could see them. "You're safe here," he said quietly. His voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that had soothed spooked horses in storms. She stared around the room, scanning every shadow, every corner, her breathing ragged. When her gaze finally settled on him, her expression shifted, not quite trust, but something less fearful than before. Caleb offered her a small bowl of water. Her cracked lips trembled as she took a sip, and then, voice rough as gravel, she whispered, "They bound me, beat me, and threw me into the river because I refused to marry the man chosen for me." The words struck Caleb like a hammer. His fists tightened, something molten burning in his chest. "All that for saying no?" he asked. She nodded, one tear sliding down her bruised cheek. "They said I was too strong to choose for myself, too large. They wanted me to bear children for him." Her voice broke and she looked away as if ashamed of her own suffering. Caleb studied her face, not with pity but with an understanding that ran deeper. "No one decides your life but you," he said firmly. She stared at him, stunned by the simplicity of the statement, as though no one had ever spoken such a thing aloud. By the time noon, sun slanted across the yard the next day, Caleb had returned from checking livestock, expecting to find the cabin still and quiet. Instead, he heard the soft clink of metal and the gentle rustle of movement inside. He pushed open the door and froze. The towering Apache woman was kneeling near the hearth, gathering thin sticks and arranging them neatly. One of his old shirts hung awkwardly on her frame, the sleeves tight around her broad forearms, the fabric straining across her chest, but she moved with calm purpose. When Caleb cleared his throat, she flinched, though not with the sharp fear of the previous night. She turned toward him, eyes clearer, breath steady. "I wanted to help," she said softly. Her voice still carried the weight of pain, yet there was a steadiness beneath it. Caleb shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." She rose slowly, picking up a skillet with hands so large the handle nearly disappeared in her grip. "I am not doing it because I owe," she murmured. "I am doing it because I want to." The cabin seemed warmer with her in it, as though the presence of another soul filled a silence Caleb had long stopped noticing. She moved with surprising grace for someone of her size, preparing a simple pot of porridge at the stove. Her arms, thick with muscle, stirred with careful gentleness that contrasted sharply with the scars still healing along her skin. Caleb watched her for a long moment before saying, "You shouldn't push yourself. Your wounds—" She responded with a faint, wry smile. "I have survived worse storms than this." Something in her confidence made Caleb smile in return, a rare expression that felt almost foreign on his face. After they shared the small meal, she stepped out onto the porch, leaning against the wooden frame as she took in the open land stretching to the horizon. The wind caught her long black hair, sweeping it aside and exposing the dark marks around her neck. She asked quietly, "You live out here alone?" Caleb nodded. "Always have." Her gaze lingered on him, searching. "No wife? No family?" He shook his head, unwilling to open the doors to the memories he had long buried. She looked away then, whispering, "In my tribe, I trust no one left." Her eyes traced the doorway, the walls, the field. "But this place, it does not frighten me." Caleb felt the truth of that quietly settle between them. Later, as twilight folded itself over the plains, she stood in the center of the room with a certainty that hadn't been there before. "If you do not send me away," she said, voice steady, "I would like to stay here." The words were not desperate. They were chosen with intention, shaped by someone who had spent years having no choices at all. Caleb met her gaze, deep and unwavering. "Then stay," he replied simply. "No conditions, no explanations, just truth." That night the wind beat against the walls, as if testing the strength of the cabin. They sat near the fire, its glow casting long shadows, hers massive and powerful, his smaller but grounded. The silence between them no longer felt empty. Myella, he had learned her name earlier that day, mended one of his old shirts with a needle, her large hands surprisingly delicate in their movements. Caleb found himself watching her from time to time, noticing the way she leaned toward the light, how her expression softened when she focused. When he rose to close the window, the cold air sweeping in, she glanced up briefly. Something in her eyes shifted, as though safety had begun forming roots inside her. "It is warmer here than anywhere I have been," she said quietly. Caleb nodded, understanding more than he spoke. As the night deepened, she pulled the blanket closer, the fire painting her features in soft orange light. After a long pause, she murmured, "It hurts, not having a man like you in my life." The honesty of it hit Caleb harder than he expected. He sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that she knew she was no burden. "I'm not a special man," he said softly. "Just someone doing what's right." Her gaze dropped to the stitching in her hands, her voice barely a whisper. "No one has ever told me I deserved better." Silence returned, but it was gentle now, not sharp. Near midnight, she shifted closer to the fire, and Caleb handed her another blanket. She hesitated, then asked, "Are you not afraid of me? I am different." Caleb held her gaze, answering in a tone that seemed to settle the air itself. "You are someone who gave me a reason to start over. There is nothing about you that scares me." At that, her shoulders loosened, as though years of carrying the world had suddenly released. Two souls who had been shaped by hardship found warmth beside a single fire, not out of desire alone, but because loneliness had finally met its match. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Winter began to loosen its grip, and thin blades of grass poked through the thawing ground. Caleb worked outside each morning, splitting logs or tending the animals, while Myella moved cautiously through the cabin, her strength returning piece by piece. Though he often told her to rest, she continued to help, sweeping the floor with long, steady strokes or boiling water so he wouldn't come in cold to an empty stove. She moved slower, but somehow seemed stronger, as if surviving the river had rooted something deeper inside her. Sometimes Caleb would return to find a small piece of cornbread waiting on the table, or the fire freshly stoked. And Myella would notice things about him too. The slight limp he tried to hide, the quiet way he touched his tools as though they were old friends, the softness that lived beneath a life carved by silence. Evening by evening, the cabin transformed from a place meant for shelter into a place that felt like it belonged to both of them, shaped by two sets of footsteps instead of one. One evening, with the sky painted red by the sinking sun, they stood together on the porch, gazing across the open land. The breeze tugged at Myella's thick hair, revealing faint scars along her neck where ropes had bitten deep. She traced them absent-mindedly, her expression distant but steady. "Caleb," she said suddenly, "if my tribe finds me again," her voice faltered, "would you hand me back to them?" Caleb didn't need time to consider. The answer rose instinctively. No. A simple word, firm as stone. Myella turned toward him, surprise widening her deep, dark eyes. For a long moment she searched his face, as though waiting for hesitation to crack through his certainty. But he only looked back at her with the quiet strength she had come to depend on. "Why?" she whispered. Caleb exhaled slowly, crossing his arms as he watched the last light fade behind the hills. "Because you aren't alone anymore," he said. "And neither am I." Myella swallowed hard, her breath catching. Something in her posture shifted. Less tension, less fear, more belonging. For the first time since arriving at his door, she allowed herself to believe she might truly be safe. The next afternoon, Caleb was tying down the ropes on the livestock pen when the earth trembled under heavy hoofbeats. He straightened instantly, scanning the eastern trail. A plume of dust rose, and from it emerged 7 Apache riders, dressed in leather armor and marked with bold strokes of red and black paint. Their formation, rigid and sharp, told Caleb they hadn't traveled here for calm conversation. He strode toward the cabin, calling Myella's name. She was already standing by the door, breathing hard, her expression filled with dread. Though her wounds had healed, the memories behind them had not. "They've come for me," she said, her voice trembling. "I knew they would." Caleb stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body, though she towered over him. "Stay behind me," he said, tone deep and unwavering. When the riders halted in front of the porch, Caleb walked out alone, unarmed. The lead warrior, marked by a thunderbolt tattoo slicing across his face, scowled at him. "White man," he growled, "you hide a criminal from our people." Caleb did not flinch. "She's committed no crime." The warrior's jaw tightened. "She defied a chosen marriage. The law demands her return." Before Caleb could reply, Myella stepped outside, standing just behind him, towering despite her trembling knees. "Caleb," she whispered urgently, "don't do this. They will kill you." But he stood rooted like a post driven deep into the earth. His voice rang out, strong enough to still the wind. "She is not going anywhere." The warriors exchanged glances, thrown off by the boldness of a man standing alone against 7 armed riders. Caleb's next words came even louder, carrying through the cold air like a vow. "She is my wife. No one has the right to take her." Myella's breath broke. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. The lead warrior snarled. "You claim one who was cast out?" Before Caleb could answer, an older man rode forward, Chief Keechis. His gaze rested on Myella, but instead of anger, his eyes held something final and resigned. "From this day forward," he said in his deep, weathered voice, "you are exiled from our tribe. We hold no claim over you." Myella dropped to her knees, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of being released from a life she no longer chose. As the riders turned and vanished into dust, Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder. She clutched him tightly, sobbing against him, and in the middle of the open field, they knew their lives were now joined in a way no tribe or law could undo. Spring slowly unfolded across the frontier, loosening winter's grip and filling the air with the scent of damp soil and young grass. The snow melted from the cabin roof in soft rhythms, dripping onto the muddy ground below. Caleb had grown accustomed to waking and hearing the quiet stir of movement inside the home, Myella tending the fire, her massive silhouette glowing in the early light. Though her strength had returned, she moved more carefully now, aware of every shift in her body. One morning, Caleb stepped outside to split wood when he noticed she was watching him from the doorway, one hand resting on her stomach with a stillness that made him pause. She walked toward him slowly, her deep black eyes carrying a new kind of certainty. Without a word, she took his calloused hand and placed it gently over her belly. In that single gesture, Caleb understood. His breath stilled, the world narrowing to the warmth beneath his palm, a small, growing life. Myella gazed up at him, voice trembling with quiet hope. "If it is a boy, will you teach him to work this land?" Caleb laughed softly, a sound that felt like sunlight after years of shadow. "And if it is a girl," he replied, "she'll ride better than the both of us." In the days that followed, the cabin seemed brighter, as though the walls themselves recognized the shift in their lives. Myella's pace slowed, but her presence grew stronger, like an ancient tree deepening its roots. Caleb built her a larger chair, sturdy enough to support her towering frame. She watched him shape the wood, a small smile tugging at her lips, pride softening her powerful features. At mealtime, she would place her hand on her belly unconsciously, as if reassuring herself that the child within was real. One evening, they sat on the porch as the sky changed from gold to violet. Myella's voice broke the silence. "Caleb, this child will have no tribe except us." He reached for her hand, small in his, though hers dwarfed his own, and squeezed gently. "Then we will be its tribe," he said. Myella's breath hitched, emotion tightening her throat. She had lived a life shaped by others' decisions, but here she had chosen her own path, and that choice had created a future she never believed she would experience. The wind carried the faint sound of running streams and newly awakened earth wrapping around them like a promise. By late spring, the land stretched wide and alive beneath a warming sky. Caleb walked the fields with a new sense of purpose, checking soil and fence posts with the awareness that everything he built now mattered for more than himself. Myella sat on the porch in the new chair, her belly rounding noticeably, yet she remained as steady and formidable as ever. Even seated, she looked like a warrior carved from stone, strong, unyielding, but her eyes held a softness that belonged only to Caleb. He draped a shawl over her shoulders, and she smiled in a way that tightened something in his chest. After a long quiet, she spoke. "The tribe cast me out. I have no name among them anymore." Her voice did not tremble, but the ache beneath it was unmistakable. Caleb turned toward her. "You have a home here," he said, "and you have me. That's enough." Myella's gaze softened, her lashes lowering as she breathed out slowly. "I used to believe I was only a tool to them, good for strength, for bearing children, but never for choosing." She touched his chest, feeling the heartbeat beneath, steady, dependable. "But here I chose, not because I had to, because I wanted to." Caleb covered her hand with his own. "I spent half my life with only silence and dust for company," he said quietly. "I never expected anything more. Then you came and somehow everything felt different." The spring wind swept across the porch, lifting strands of Myella's long hair and carrying the scent of warming earth. She looked into his eyes, her voice low but clear. "I do not want to belong to any law anymore. I choose you." Caleb didn't hesitate. "And I choose you." No ceremony, no blessing, no witness but the open sky. Just two souls who had known abandonment and hardship, now bound by a commitment deeper than any written vow. Myella leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath warm through the thin fabric of his shirt. "This child," she murmured, "will grow up knowing its parents chose each other freely." Caleb placed his hand over her belly once more, feeling the faint pulse of life beneath. "And it will know it was loved from the start," he said. As the sun dipped behind the hills, their silhouettes, one large, one smaller, merged into a single shape framed against the horizon. Out on the vast frontier, where the world often demanded strength over tenderness, they had created a home built on choice, protection, and quiet love. And they knew they belonged nowhere else but in each other's lives.